The rain did not merely fall upon the glass roof of the Thorne conservatory. It descended with the rhythmic, punishing weight of gravel thrown against a coffin. Within those transparent walls, the air smelled of damp peat, ancient iron, and the desperate, cloying sweetness of the lunar orchids, the last silver-white ghosts of a fortune that had long since bled into the ledger's red ink. Elara Thorne stood in the center of this fragile sanctuary, her spine held with the rigid propriety of a woman who had learned that grace was the only currency one could not borrow from a bank. Her fingers, perpetually stained with the soot-dark ink of the family accounts, were currently numb with a cold that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the manor. The house was holding its breath. Or perhaps it was simply dying, one cracked window pane and one unpaid debt at a time. She knelt before the central podium where the most delicate of the orchids sat, its petals as pale and translucent as the skin of a spectre. The temperature in the conservatory had dropped dangerously low, and the coal for the heating pipes was a luxury her father, Arthur Thorne, could no longer justify. Elara leaned forward, her movements scrupulous and practiced, and cupped her hands around the trembling flower. She did not pray, for she had found that God rarely concerned himself with the arithmetic of glassworks, but she breathed. She offered the small, flickering warmth of her own lungs to the plant, a futile protest against the creeping frost that threatened to claim the only beauty left in her life. This was the reality of her existence, a constant, exhausting vigil over things that were destined to break. Her father spoke of the Duke of Ashbourne in the same way a condemned man might speak of a reprieve, though Elara knew better. To the world, Julian Vane was a titan of industry and land, a man whose silence was said to be as vast and cold as the northern sea. To her, he was merely a vulture, a creature of high status waiting for the Thorne estate to draw its final, rattling breath so he might pick the bones clean. Arthur had promised her to him in a marriage of convenience that felt more like a foreclosure. He had not asked her. He had simply presented the contract as though she were another piece of equipment in the glassworks, a functional asset to be traded for a clean slate. The wind shrieked, a sudden, violent gust that made the iron frame of the building groan like a living thing in pain. It was in that moment of auditory chaos that she felt it, a shift in the air pressure, a presence that had not been there a moment before. It was not the familiar, heavy tread of her father, nor the shuffling gait of their one remaining servant. This was something different. The silence that followed the wind had teeth, sharp and expectant. Someone was standing in the shadows near the northern door, a silhouette that was darker than the midnight sky pressing against the glass. Elara froze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, her mind immediately leaping to the rumors of industrial spies sent by Silas Blackwood to sabotage their remaining stock. She did not scream. Fear, in her experience, was a luxury for those who did not have work to do. Instead, she reached for the heavy brass shears she had left on the potting bench, her smudged hands closing around the cold metal with a trembling but certain grip. The intruder did not move. He stood perfectly still, a tall, broad-shouldered shadow that seemed to absorb the moonlight. He did not speak, he did not announce himself, and his refusal to do so felt like a deliberate insult. A manifestation of the arrogance of those who believed they could take whatever they wished from a house in decline. He was a sorrow wearing a man's coat, looming over her orchids like a harbinger of the end. In the pitch-black shadows, Elara's vision was a blur of grey and ink, but her indignation was a sharp, incandescent flame. She convinced herself that this was Silas Blackwood's man, a thief, come to steal the lunar orchids and ensure the Thorne family never saw the sunrise with their dignity intact. As the figure took a single deliberate step toward her, the floorboards of the conservatory creaked with a weight that felt like an accusation. Panicked defiance, sharp and jagged, surged through her. She did not calculate the risk. She did not consider the propriety of a lady's conduct. She simply lunged forward, her arms swinging in a wide, desperate arc. The sting in her palm was instantaneous, a sharp electric shock that vibrated up to her shoulder as her hand made contact with the intruder's jaw. The sound of the slap was unnervingly loud in the cavernous space, a crack like a whip that seemed to echo off every pane of glass. She had struck him with the full force of her desperation, her anger and her grief. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop, The wind ceased its howling, and the very air in the conservatory grew stagnant and heavy. Elara gasped, her breath hitching in her throat, her legs feeling like water as she realized the sheer audacity of what she had done. The stranger did not retaliate. He did not raise a hand to strike her back, nor did he lunge at her with the violence she had expected. Instead, there was only the sound of his breath catching, a sharp, jagged inhalation that broke a decade of cold, aristocratic silence. It was a sound of profound vulnerability, a ragged gasp that suggested the blow had landed on something far deeper than his skin. He remained perfectly still. His head turned slightly from the force of the impact. The silence that followed was not the void she had feared, but a living thing, dense with an emotion she could not yet name. Elara stood her ground, though her knees shook and her blackened digits clutched the brass shears until the metal bit into her palm. She could see the faint glint of his eyes in the dark, cool, grey eyes that seemed to be looking at her, as though she were the first person he had truly seen in years. He was speechless, his presence a heavy, grounding weight against her internal storm. In that suffocating darkness, she did not see the fine wool of his coat or the signet ring on his hand. She only saw the silhouette of a figure who had been struck and had chosen to absorb the blow rather than crush the woman who delivered it. The violet bruise had not yet formed on his jaw, but the mark of her rebellion was already written into the stillness of the room. "I would never marry you," she whispered into the dark, her voice trembling with a tearful, frantic rage she could no longer contain, directed at the phantom of the Duke her father had chosen, yet delivered to the man standing inches away from her. "I would rather burn this estate to the ground. I would rather see every pane of this glass shattered than submit to a man who thinks he can buy a soul like a piece of livestock." The stranger said nothing. He did not move to defend the Duke's honor, nor did he mock her for her outbursts. He simply stood there, his breath slowing, his gaze fixed on her face, as if he were memorizing the sound of her defiance. The lunar orchids shivered in the draught, their silver petals glowing faintly in the gloom. Oblivious to the fact that the vulture Duke was currently standing in their midst, his jaw stinging from the hand of the woman he had come to claim. The silence, it seemed, had teeth, and tonight it had finally bitten back. The sting in Elara's palm was a sharp, vibrating pulse that seemed to count the seconds of the stranger's impossible stillness. He did not roar in indignation, nor did he seize her wrists with the crushing strength of a man wronged. Instead, he simply stood, a towering column of shadow against the silver-ribbed glass of the conservatory, his breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches that she could feel against the damp, rain-cooled air. The silence between them was not a void, but a weight, a physical presence that pressed against her chest until she felt her own heart struggling to find its rhythm. "You think me a fool," Elara hissed, her voice trembling with a frantic, brittle edge that she could not master. "You think you can creep through the shadows like a common thief to steal what my father has left? Go back to your master. Go back to the Vulture Duke and tell him that Thorne Manor may be crumbling, but its spirit is not yet a ledger item to be bought and sold by a man who calculates the worth of a soul in shillings and pence." The stranger remained an unmoving pillar, his face obscured by the tumultuous darkness of the storm outside, yet she felt the intensity of his gaze, a haunted, searching heat that made the hair on her neck rise. The lunar orchids, those fragile silver-white ghosts of the botanical world, swayed between them in their glass housing, their luminescence casting a pale, sickly glow upon his boots. They were the only things of value left in this mausoleum of a house, and Elara felt a feral, protective instinct rise within her, a desperation that bypassed propriety and went straight to the bone. "I know the price of my father's failures," she continued, the words spilling out like a confession she had held in her lungs until they burned. "I know he has promised me to Julian Vane to settle the Thorne debts. He thinks a title can mask the rot of a peer who has not spoken a kind word to the world in 7 years. But I tell you now, spy, as I would tell that heartless aristocrat to his face, if he had the courage to look at a woman instead of a balance sheet, I would never marry him. I would rather strike a match and let this entire conservatory consume itself in a pyre of lunar orchids than allow myself to be the payment for a debt I did not sign. If he wants Ashworth, let him take the stones and the soot, for he shall never have the breath within these walls." She was gasping now, her soot-darkened hands clutching the edge of a potting bench to keep from collapsing. She had said it. She had shouted her rebellion into the teeth of the night, admitting her hatred for the man who held her future in his calloused, aristocratic hands. The stranger did not move to strike her, nor did he offer a defense for the man she had just maligned. He simply stood there, a walking embodiment of grief wrapped in dark wool, absorbing her vitriol as if it were a rain he had been expecting for a very long time. The stranger did not answer. The oppressive stillness felt predatory. It bit into the air, consuming the space between them until Elara felt she might suffocate under the gravity of his unmoving presence. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace that was almost ghostly, the shadow withdrew. He did not turn to flee in the manner of a common intruder. He simply dissolved into the deeper darkness of the foyer, his footsteps making no sound against the damp stone floor, leaving only the scent of wet slate and something faint, like old parchment and bergamot, lingering in his wake. Elara stood alone, the frantic pounding of her pulse the only sound in the cavernous room. The house was holding its breath, the ancient timbers of the conservatory groaning, as if they, too, were weary of the secrets she had just hurled into the void. Her hand was still burning, a violet sort of pain that suggested she had struck something far more substantial than a mere man. She had struck the very air of her destiny. Outside, the summer storm began to abate, the heavy rhythmic thrumming on the glass roof settling into a rhythmic, melancholic drip that sounded like the ticking of an unforgiving clock. She looked down at her palm, which was pale and trembling in the moonlight. She had committed a scrupulous act of treason against her own house, admitting her refusal to a stranger who could be anyone. A rival from the glassworks, a journalist seeking scandal, or worse, one of the Duke's own men sent to survey the property before the formal seizure. The arithmetic of her situation was brutal and honest. She had no dowry, no allies, and now perhaps no anonymity. A flicker of light appeared at the far end of the corridor, moving slowly through the gloom of the main house. The smell of beeswax reached her before the voice did. The familiar, comforting scent of an honest tallow candle being carried by someone who belonged in the light. It was the soft, shuffling sound of a servant, perhaps old Mrs. Gable, coming to check the latches after the thunderclaps had ceased. Elara quickly wiped her soot-marked hands on her apron, her mind performing a frantic, irregular calculation of fear. She could not stay here. Smelling of rain and rebellion, she had to retreat to her room, to the safety of her narrow bed and her quiet books, and pray that the morning did not bring the consequences of her midnight strike. As she hurried toward the back stairs, the conservatory felt suddenly larger, colder, as if the departure of the stranger had taken the warmth from the very stones. She had spent years mastering the art of being invisible, of being the competent wallflower who managed the ledgers while her father managed the illusions. But tonight she had been seen, and the memory of that silent, speechless witness felt like a mark she would never be able to wash away. Upstairs, in the solitude of her chamber, Elara did not light a lamp. She sat by the window, watching the first grey tendrils of dawn begin to bruise the eastern sky. The sting in her hand had faded to a dull ache, but the weight in her chest had only grown. She thought of the titled Lord, the man her father spoke of with such desperate fawning hope, and she felt a renewed surge of indignation. Tomorrow, no, today, he would arrive to claim his due. He would bring his cold eyes and his silent demands, and she would be expected to stand in the parlor like a prize mare at auction. She closed her eyes, the image of the stranger in the dark rising unbidden behind her lids. The way he had not moved, the way he had seemed to breathe with the house itself. It was a haunting, impossible encounter, and as the light of the sun began to touch the glass of the conservatory far by low, Elara Thorne knew that the silence of the night had been the last peace she would ever truly know. The morning arrived, not with the gentle bloom of a summer rose, but with the harsh, unforgiving clarity of a witness. The light was a creditor, peering through the frayed velvet curtains of the breakfast room, to count every moth-eaten thread and every smudge of soot that the night had deposited upon the Thorne household. Elara stood by the mahogany sideboard, her spine as rigid as the industrial chimneys that once defined her family's wealth. Beneath the lace of her cuffs, her fingers remained stained with the dark, stubborn ink of the night's ledgers and the damp earth of the conservatory floor. She had scrubbed until the skin was raw, yet the memory of the stranger's presence and the heavy, resonant impact of her palm against his jaw clung to her like the smell of the coming rain. It was a secret that felt heavier than the house itself, a weight that threatened to buckle the very floorboards beneath her feet. Arthur Thorne entered the room with a gait that attempted a jaunty confidence, but succeeded only in highlighting the tremor in his hands. He did not look at his daughter. He looked instead at the long, dark shadow of the Thorne ledger, which sat upon the writing desk like a silent, accusing judge. It was a volume of brutal arithmetic, a chronicle of how pride and the failing glassworks had slowly dismantled a legacy of fire and craftsmanship. Arthur reached for a tarnished silver spoon laid out for breakfast, his movements mechanical and fraught with a strange, nervous energy. With a frantic, pathetic intensity, he began to polish the dull metal with the silk of his sleeve, as if he could rub away the years of insolvency through sheer, desperate friction. The spoon was a relic of a grander age, its surface scarred by decades of neglect, yet he polished it as though it were the only shield he had left against the world. "He will be here within the hour, Elara," Arthur said, his voice carrying the thin, brittle quality of overfired glass. "His Grace is a man of scrupulous habits. His Grace does not tolerate the inefficiency of a late host." He continued to scrub the silver, his knuckles turning a ghostly white against the tarnished metal. To Elara, the sight was agonizing. A man attempting to salvage an aristocratic facade while the bones of the house groaned under the weight of his failures. She wanted to tell him that no amount of silver polish could hide the rot in the floorboards or the desperation in their eyes, but she remained silent. The memory of her lunar orchids, those fragile silver-white inhabitants of the greenhouse, served as her only anchor in the rising tide of her panic. She was a woman of ledgers and logic, yet she found herself praying that the stranger from the conservatory had been nothing more than a common thief, and not the man who now held their lives in his calloused, aristocratic hands. The sound of the carriage wheels upon the gravel was the sound of a closing trap. It was a rhythmic, heavy percussion that seemed to vibrate through the masonry, a sound that Elara felt in the soles of her feet long before it reached her ears. She moved to the parlor, her heart a frantic bird trapped behind the iron cage of her ribs. The house, it seemed, was holding its breath, the very walls leaning inward to catch the coming storm. The air grew heavy with the scent of bergamot and something deeper, the smell of rain-soaked earth and old, expensive leather. When the doors finally opened, it was not a man who entered, but a silence so profound it seemed to have a physical weight of its own. It was a silence that did not merely occupy the room. It consumed the chatter and the nervous energy of her father, leaving only the cold reality of the moment. Julian Vane, the Duke of Ashbourne, stepped across the threshold. He did not possess the booming, glass-shattering arrogance of Silas Blackwood, or the desperate, high-pitched chatter of her father. He was a creature of absolute stillness, a presence that commanded the space simply by refusing to compete with the noise of the world. He was tall, his frame draped in black wool that made him look like an avatar of melancholy wrapped in winter cloth. For a moment, Elara could not breathe. She stood in the shadow of the heavy drapes, watching as he inclined his head to Arthur with a precision that bordered on the clinical. And then, the sharp morning light from the tall parlor window caught the line of his jaw. There, blossoming against the pale, aristocratic skin like a dark omen, was the violet bruise. It was the exact, undeniable shape of her own palm, a mark of rebellion burned into the face of the most powerful man in the county. The room seemed to tilt beneath Elara's feet, the floorboards turning to liquid as the truth crashed through her defenses. The spy she had cursed, the stranger she had struck with all the fury of her trapped soul, was the fiancé her father had chosen to save them from the arithmetic of ruin. The shame was a physical coldness, a winter that settled in her marrow and turned her blood to ice. She without him to speak, for the thunder of his indignation to bring the ceiling down upon her head. She waited for the sharp, legal retribution that would surely follow such a scrupulous assault upon a peer of the realm. Every second of his silence was a lash against her pride. But Julian did not look at her face. He did not demand an apology, or even offer a formal greeting that might satisfy the requirements of propriety. Instead, his grey eyes, the cool, unreadable grey of a sky that has not decided whether to clear, dropped to her hands. He looked at the ink beneath her nails, at the faint red welts where she had scrubbed away the grime of the greenhouse and the soot of the glassworks. He looked at her as if she were not a bride-to-be, but a complicated architectural plan he was attempting to solve with silent, intense focus. In that long, agonizing silence, Elara realized that he was not searching for the lady of the house or the daughter of a desperate man. He was searching for the woman who had stood her ground in the dark and told him she would never be bought. "I am told," Julian said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that felt like the vibration of a distant struck bell, "that you have a particular talent for the preservation of rare things, Miss Thorne." He did not touch the bruise on his jaw, nor did he acknowledge the violence of their first encounter with anything more than a steady, unwavering gaze. He simply stood there, a wounded, silent duke, and for the first time in her life, Elara felt that she was being truly seen, not as a daughter, a debt, or a decorative object, but as the fierce, competent architect of her own sanctuary. The sting in her palm had finally met its match in the stillness of his soul. The breakfast room of Thorne Manor was a chamber that had long forgotten how to breathe. It was a mausoleum of faded damask and tarnished silver, where the morning light arrived not as a guest, but as an unforgiving creditor. The sun, pale and watery as it filtered through the grime of the tall windows, illuminated every frayed thread in the carpet and every desperate line on Arthur Thorne's face. Arthur sat at the head of the table, his movements sharp and frantic, a man attempting to perform the theatre of aristocratic ease, while the stage collapsed beneath his feet. He poured the tea with a hand that trembled, the porcelain lid of the pot chattering a rhythmic, nervous code against the rim. Across from him sat Julian Vane, the Duke of Ashbourne, and the silence that radiated from the man was so heavy it seemed to possess a physical mass. It was a grounding tectonic weight that pinned the very air to the floor. Julian did not speak. He did not even seem to observe the array of cold mutton and congealed eggs before him. Instead, he remained perfectly still, his spine a column of iron that did not touch the back of his chair. To Elara Thorne, sitting with her spine equally straight and her ink-stained fingers hidden beneath the table, he was no longer the shadow she had struck in the dark. He was a catastrophic reality. The morning light was far more cruel than the midnight storm had been, for it revealed with agonizing clarity the mark on his jaw. There, against the pale, scrupulous perfection of his skin, was a faint violet bruise, a signature of her own panic, a physical manifestation of her rebellion that now throbbed in the quiet of the room. It was an indictment written in bruised tissue, and Elara found she could not swallow past the cold lump of shame in her throat. For Julian, the room was a cacophony of vibrations that no one else seemed to notice. He did not look at the bruise. In the mirror that morning, for he did not need a reflection to tell him he had been altered, he felt the heat of it, a dull hum of life on a face that had been a mask for 7 years. He mapped the room through the soles of his boots and the tips of his fingers, which rested lightly, almost imperceptibly, against the edge of the mahogany table. He felt the vibration of Arthur's chattering teapot, the scraping of a fork, the distant rhythmic ticking of a clock in the hall that sounded, to his heightened senses, like a hammer against an anvil. He was not being rude. He was simply attempting to calculate the arithmetic of the space, to find the one frequency that would allow him to remain anchored amidst the sensory storm of the Thorne household. Arthur continued to fill the silence with a desperate, hollow commentary on the weather and the local grain prices, his voice thin and brittle as dried parchment. He spoke of the glassworks in tones of forced optimism, studiously avoiding the fact that the very man sitting at his table was the one holding the ledger of their destruction. Elara watched her father, her heart aching with a mixture of pity and simmering indignation. It was a performance of dignity that fooled no one, least of all the Duke. Julian's gaze finally shifted, but it did not settle on Arthur. It drifted toward Elara, and for a moment the grey of his eyes was the color of a winter sea before a gale. He gazed at her, truly observed her, and in that gaze, there was no anger, only a haunted, terrifying curiosity. The meal ended not with a word, but with a sudden, deliberate stillness from Julian that silenced even Arthur's prattle. The Duke rose, his movements as fluid and controlled as a predator's, and he turned his attention away from the master of the house, He studied her, his eyes dropping briefly to her hands, which she had inadvertently brought to the table. Hands that bore the faint, stubborn shadows of ink and the raw, red marks of a gardener's toil. He did not ask for the apology she had spent the last hour rehearsing in the cathedral of her mind. He did not demand satisfaction for the insult of her blow. Instead, he inclined his head a mere fraction of an inch, his voice emerging as a low, gravelly rumble that she had not truly heard in the frantic chaos of the conservatory. "The orchids," Julian said, the words vibrating through the air like a struck chord. "Show them to me." The walk to the conservatory was a journey through a dying body. The house held its breath as they passed through the long, drafty galleries where the portraits of Elara's ancestors seemed to watch their progress with judgmental, painted eyes. The smell of beeswax and old dust gave way, gradually, to the scent of damp slate and wet earth as they neared the glass-walled sanctuary. As Elara pushed open the heavy iron doors, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The air here was thick, humid, and alive, a sharp contrast to the static, frozen halls of the manor. The Thorne Conservatory was a cathedral of glass and light, and at its heart sat the lunar orchids, their silver-white petals closed tight against the morning sun, waiting for the moon to call them back to life. Julian stepped into the space and stopped. He closed his eyes, his head tilting back as he inhaled the scent of crushed moss and ancient stone. The tension that had held his shoulders in a rigid line since breakfast seemed to thaw, just a fraction, as the chaotic vibrations of the house were replaced by the steady, quiet pulse of the living world. Elara watched him, her breath hitching in her chest as he approached the bench where the most delicate of the plants resided. He did not look like a vulture duke here. He looked more like a soul who had forgotten how to breathe in any room that contained the noise of other people. He reached out a hand, the same hand that had caught her wrist in the dark, and hovered his fingers over a velvet soft leaf. He did not touch it at first, but simply felt the life warmth radiating from the plant. Then, with a gesture so gentle it made Elara's eyes sting with unexpected tears, he brushed the leaf with the side of his hand, the exact part of his flesh that had met the force of her strike the night before. It was a silent bridge, a deliberate connection between the violence of their first meeting and the fragile peace of the present. He was touching the orchid as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Is his calloused skin a dark contrast against the silver white of the plant? "They are dying," Julian observed, his voice so quiet it was barely a whisper above the sigh of the wind against the glass. It was not a question, nor was it a judgment. It was a simple, brutal truth, the kind of honest arithmetic that Elara understood in her very bones. He looked up then, his grey eyes catching the light of the conservatory, and for the first time, Elara did not see a stranger or an aristocrat. She saw a man who understood the cost of survival in a world that wanted to turn everything to stone. He looked at her, and the violet bruise on his jaw seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the house. "Tell me," he said, his gaze unwavering, "how do we keep them alive?" The conservatory seemed to exhale with them, a vast, humid lung of iron and glass that vibrated with the rhythm of the dying storm. Elara Thorne stood within the labyrinth of verdant shadows, the silver-white petals of the lunar orchids shimmering in the gloom like fallen stars caught in a web of emerald silk. Julian Vane's presence behind her was a physical pressure, a reminder of the violet mark she had etched upon his jaw only hours before. Elara paused, her darkened fingertips trembling slightly as she adjusted the wick of a small oil lamp, casting a warm, amber glow over the delicate blooms. "The care of these flowers is a matter of scrupulous arithmetic rather than mere sentiment," Elara said, her voice sounding thin and precise against the drumming of the rain. She did not look at him, focusing instead on the fine, crystalline dust that coated the orchid's leaves. They require a temperature that mimics the cool of a high mountain pass, yet they must never feel the direct touch of a draft. If the air grows too heavy, the petals will begin to bruise from their own weight. If it grows too dry, they simply vanish, dissolving into a fine grey ash before the dawn can reach them. She reached out to adjust a lead weight on the pulley system that regulated the ventilation, her movements practiced and sure. It is a constant negotiation with the environment, a demand for absolute equilibrium that most people find too exhausting to maintain. Julian remained standing at the edge of the light, his grey eyes fixed upon the orchids with a haunted curiosity that Elara had not expected. He did not lean in, nor did he attempt to touch the fragile things. He simply existed in the space beside her, his silence no longer the sharp, jagged weapon it had been in the parlor. Instead, it had become a chamber, a quiet room where her words could settle without being dissected by the cruel wit of the London season. He watched the way she tested the moisture of the soil with a silver probe, his gaze tracing the architecture of her concentration. In the stillness of the conservatory, the aristocratic visitor seemed less like a vulture and more akin to someone who had forgotten how to breathe in any room that contained the noise of other people. "These flowers thrive here because this is the quietest part of the house," Julian finally remarked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the humid air. The quietude carried a jagged edge, but here those edges were blunt, softened by the damp earth and the ancient brooding glass. He stepped forward, the lamplight catching the sharp line of his profile and the faint, darkening bruise on his jaw. It is a rare thing to find a place that does not demand to be filled with chatter or the grinding of gears. Most houses are restless, always whispering of the debts they owe to the past. But this room is simply holding its breath. He looked at Elara then, and in that novel moment, she did not see a creditor or a stranger. She saw a reflection of the same isolation that had governed her own life among the ledgers and the glassworks. The smell of damp earth and the cool, metallic scent of the glass reached her before she realized they had moved into a different kind of proximity. Elara reached for a pair of small, sharp pruning shears, her mind already shifting into the rhythmic necessity of the work. There was a branch of a neighboring fern that had grown too bold, its heavy fronds threatening to steal the light from the primary lunar orchid. Without being asked, Julian reached out his hand, not to take the shears, but to hold the fern back, creating a clear path for her hand. His touch was steady, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as they moved the coarse foliage. There was no subtext of high society in the gesture, no hidden demand for propriety. It was the simple, functional collaboration of two people faced with a task that required both precision and restraint. They worked in a shared, rhythmic labor that bypassed the need for the treacherous medium of speech. Elara moved with the clinical grace of a surgeon, her shears making soft, percussive sounds as she cleared the unnecessary growth, while Julian acted as her silent second, anticipating the movement of her hands before she could even signal her intent. It was competence porn of the most intimate sort, a synchronization of purpose that turned the act of gardening into a sanctuary. In this humid, greenlit world, the boundaries of rank and gender felt as thin and transparent as the glass above them. She was not the impoverished daughter of a failing glassworks, and he was not the duke who held her family's fate in his ledger. They were merely two sets of hands, working to preserve a life that was too fragile to survive the world outside. The dampness of the conservatory began to seep into her clothes, but Elara did not mind the chill. There was a profound comfort in the way. Julian's presence had shifted from a threat to a shield. He did not offer empty compliments or the hollow observations of a gentleman trying to be useful. He simply observed the arithmetic of her movements and matched them with his own. Every time she reached for a fresh tie or a handful of bone meal, he was there, his movements economical and hushed. It was as if he understood that in this room, words were a form of pollution, a discordant noise that would only disturb the delicate equilibrium they were trying to maintain. The silence between them grew heavy, but it was no longer the silence of a grave. It was the silence of a house that had finally found someone who knew how to listen to its bones. By the time the last fern was restrained and the orchids were properly fed, the storm outside had settled into a rhythmic, steady weeping. Elara stepped back, wiping her blemished hands on her apron, her breath hitching as she realized how close Julian had remained. He was still holding the final frond in place, his gaze fixed on the silver-white bloom they had just saved. In the amber light of the lamp, the violet bruise on his jaw seemed less an injury and more a mark of recognition, a sign that their first, violent meeting had been the only honest interaction either of them had experienced in years. She looked at the Duke, and for a fleeting moment, the weight of her father's choice did not feel like a cage, but like a door she was finally beginning to unlock. He observed her and did not see a commodity. He saw a woman who knew the cost of keeping a soul alive in the dark. The peace of the conservatory, that fragile sanctuary of glass and silver, was shattered by the discordant grinding of a carriage against the gravel drive. The house, which had only just begun to breathe in the rhythmic silence of Julian's presence, seemed to hold its breath once more. Elara felt the shift in the air before she heard the voice, a sharp, metallic tenor that sliced through the damp, floral atmosphere like a rusted blade. It was Silas Blackwood. He entered the greenhouse without an invitation, his presence an immediate sensory assault that made the delicate lunar orchids seem to recoil in their silver-rimmed pots. Silas wore his ambitions as overtly as he wore his heavy, cloying sandalwood scent, a perfume that attempted to mask the smell of coal dust and calculated greed. Behind him trailed Arthur Thorne, his shoulders hunched in a posture of perpetual apology. Silas ignored the plans. He appraised the architecture, his eyes calculating the cost of the iron struts and the value of the acreage beyond the glass. He carried a silver-topped cane, which he used not for support, but as a pointer to mark the things he intended to possess. With a casual, terrifying lack of propriety, Silas swung the cane, tapping it sharply against one of the glass panes. The sound was a high, piercing note that vibrated through the structure, a sound that Elara realized with a sharp pang of empathy was an agony to the man standing beside her. Julian did not move. He stood in the center of the path, his hands clasped behind his back, his grey eyes fixed on a point somewhere above Silas's left shoulder. To an outside observer, he appeared the very image of aristocratic boredom, a statue carved from cold, unyielding granite. But Elara, standing close enough to see the minute tension in his jaw, noticed the way the violet bruise on his cheek seemed to darken as he mastered his response. The silence between the two men was not a void. It was a battlefield. Silas, emboldened by Julian's lack of verbal greeting, stepped further into the room, his boots clicking loudly on the stone floor. A rhythmic tapping that felt like a hammer striking a nerve. "A charming ruin, Thorne," Silas remarked, his voice echoing too loudly against the glass. He turned his attention to Julian, offering a bow that was technically correct but entirely devoid of respect. "And, Your Grace, I had not expected to find such an exalted nobleman tending to weeds in a drafty greenhouse. I understood your interests lay more in the terminal aspects of an estate, the acquisition of debts and the liquidation of assets." Silas laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and reached out with his cane to nudge the corner of a nearby workbench where the Thorne ledger sat. That leather-bound volume held the honest, brutal arithmetic of her family's survival. The intrusion was predatory. Silas moved toward the workbench, wishing to prove he held the power of the purse over the Thorne lineage, and to humiliate the man he saw as a weak, silent rival. He did not understand that Julian's silence was not a lack of will, but a form of containment, a master's grip on a soul that felt the world too keenly. As Silas reached for the ledger, his fingers splaying with a greedy energy, Elara felt her own spine stiffen, her stained hands curling into fists. She was ready to speak, to defend the secrets contained within that scarred leather cover. But she did not have to. Julian moved. It was not a fast movement, nor was it aggressive in the common sense. He simply took a single deliberate step forward, placing himself between Silas and the workbench. He did not raise his hand, nor did he offer a verbal rebuke. He merely stood. The sudden cessation of Silas's noise was more jarring than the tapping of the cane had been. Julian's presence expanded to fill the room, a heavy, grounding weight that seemed to press the very air from Silas's lungs. The sudden lack of sound felt dangerously sharp, cold, and utterly unforgiving. Silas froze, his hand hovering inches from the Duke's coat. He looked up, meeting Julian's gaze, and for the first time, the smirk on the merchant's face faltered. Julian did not blink. He looked at Silas not as a man looks at an enemy, but as a judge looks at a scrupulous error in a ledger, something that must be corrected or erased. The silence stretched, becoming a physical thing, a barrier that Silas could not find the breath to break. Arthur Thorne stood in the doorway, witnessing a display of power that required neither wealth nor words. It was the authority of a leader who knew the exact value of his own soul and found the man before him wanting. "The Duke is here as my guest, Mr. Blackwood," Elara said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the atmosphere like a bell. "And this conservatory is a place of work, not a counting house. If you have business with my father, I suggest you conduct it in the library, where the walls are made of stone." She saw the way Silas's eyes darted to her in shock. He looked back at Julian, seeking some sign of disapproval, but he found none. Instead, he saw Julian's hand descend, slowly and with infinite precision, to rest upon the Thorne ledger. It was a claim of protection. Julian's fingers covered the title of the book, shielding the Thorne family's failures from the prying eyes of a vulture. Silas Blackwood, sensing that the atmospheric pressure in the room had become untenable, took a stumbling step back. He attempted to recover his dignity, adjusting his lapels and giving his cane a sharp twirl, but the gesture lacked its previous confidence. The Duke had not said a single word, yet Silas felt as though he had been tried, convicted, and cast out. "Very well," Silas muttered, his voice a strained thing. "We shall discuss the glassworks in the library, Thorne. But do not think that silence pays the interest on a debt." He turned on his heel, his exit hurried, with Arthur Thorne scurrying after him like a leaf caught in a gale. As the door swung shut, the silence that remained was no longer a battlefield, but a shared breath. Elara looked at Julian. Seeing the way his hand remained on the ledger, his shoulders slowly losing their rigid, defensive set, she realized then that Julian's stoicism was his greatest weapon, a shield that protected not just himself, but everyone he allowed within his circle of quiet. "Thank you," she whispered, the sound barely more than a sigh. Julian avoided her gaze immediately. He kept his eyes on the closed door, ensuring the discord had truly left the house. When he finally turned to her, the violet mark on his jaw seemed like a badge of their shared understanding. He moved his hand from the ledger, his fingers trailing across the leather for a moment longer than necessary. In that touch, Elara saw the man her father had chosen, not a heartless aristocrat, but a guardian who understood that some things, like orchids and families, required a sanctuary. The house, it seemed, was finally learning how to breathe again. The study of Thorne Manor was a room that had long forgotten the scent of fresh air, replaced instead by the cloying, stagnant aroma of old dust and dying pride. It was a mausoleum dedicated to the arithmetic of ruin, where every shelf groaned under the weight of unsuccessful others, and every shadow seemed to hide a creditor's demand. Elara Thorne stood in the doorway, her spine as unyielding as the iron glass frames of the conservatory, watching her father. Arthur Thorne was hunched over his desk, the flickering candlelight casting elongated, skeletal shadows against the velvet curtains that had not been drawn back in 3 days. He did not look up as she entered. He was too deeply immersed in the singular object that governed their shared misery, the Thorne ledger. It was a thick, leather-bound volume that possessed a gravity of its own, containing the honest, brutal truth of their family's decline. Elara moved forward, her steps silent on the threadbare carpet, until she stood directly across from the father who had, for 21 years, been the architect of her world. She noted the frantic way his quill scratched against the parchment, a jagged, desperate rhythm that spoke of a mind attempting to outrun its own failures. Without a word, she reached out and placed her hand, still faintly stained with the indigo ink of her own private records, directly onto the open page. The movement was not aggressive, but it was absolute. Arthur finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with a yellowed exhaustion that made Elara's heart ache even through her indignation. He attempted to pull the book away, his fingers trembling, but she held fast. She did not seek permission. She sought the truth that had been whispered about in the village and wielded like a weapon by men like Silas Blackwood. She turned the ledger toward her, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers with a professional, cold precision. She had spent years mastering the mathematics of the glassworks, and she knew the language of debt better than she knew the lyrics of any ballroom melody. What she found, however, was not the predatory architecture of a takeover. Her breath caught in her throat as she traced a series of massive injections of capital, sums that had systematically erased their most pressing liabilities over the last 6 months. The source was listed with a scrupulous, almost painful anonymity, yet the handwriting was unmistakable. It was a precise, minimalist script, devoid of the flourishes common to men of their rank. It was the hand of Julian Vane. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. Julian had not been circling their estate like a vulture waiting for the carcass to rot. He had been the invisible pillar holding the roof above their heads. Every debt to the glass suppliers, every back payment for the laborers, every mortgage interest that had threatened to cast them into the street. It had all been settled. And yet there was no record of a transfer of deed, no clause of forfeiture. It was a gift of staggering, silent magnitude. She looked at her father, her voice a low, dangerous rasp. She asked him why the Duke's name appeared here as a benefactor and not a creditor. Arthur's face crumpled, the mask of patriarchal dignity finally shattering to reveal the hollow, frightened man beneath. He confessed that Julian had come to him months ago, offering a settlement that required nothing but Arthur's silence and the promise of a future alliance. But Arthur, gripped by a pride that was as fragile as the glass they manufactured, had hidden the truth. He had allowed Elara to believe the Duke was a monster, a cold-blooded aristocrat coming to claim her as payment for a debt, because it was easier to be the victim of a tyrant than the recipient of a stranger's charity. He had framed Julian as the villain to preserve the illusion that he, Arthur, was still the master of Thorne Manor. Elara backed away from the desk, the heavy leather of the ledger feeling like lead in her hands. The betrayal was not the Duke's. It was the house itself that had lied to her. She felt a sudden, suffocating need for the cold, honest air of the conservatory. She turned and fled the room, leaving her father to the silence of his mahogany tomb. The walk to the conservatory was a blur of flickering candlelight and the heavy, rhythmic thud of her own heart. When she reached the glass doors, she stopped, her reflection staring back at her from the darkened panes. In the moonlight, her skin looked like marble, and her eyes were dark pits of realization. She looked down at her right hand, the hand that had struck Julian Vane in the darkness only a short time ago. The sting had long since faded, but the memory of it now felt like an open wound. She had called him a heartless collector. She had told him she would rather burn her heritage to the ground than belong to him. And he, the man who had quietly saved her family without demanding a single word of gratitude, had stood there and taken her blow in total silence. He had worn her hatred like he wore his grief, with a stoicism that she had mistaken for arrogance. The violet bruise she had seen on his jaw that morning was not a mark of his villainy, but a testament to her own blind, frantic cruelty. She moved deeper into the sanctuary of the Lunar Orchids, the silver-white petals glowing like fallen stars in the gloom. The smell of damp earth and living green things usually calmed her, but tonight the air felt charged with the weight of her own shame. She realized now that Julian's silence was not a void of emotion. It was a fortress built to contain a world that was too loud, too chaotic, too demanding. He did not speak because he was listening to the things others ignored. The breathing of the house, the needs of the soil, the quiet desperation of a woman who thought she was alone. She stood among the flowers, her ink-stained fingers moving with scrupulous precision. She had spent her life priding herself on her competence, on her ability to see the truth in a ledger, when the men around her saw only what they wished to see. Yet, she had been utterly, catastrophically wrong about the one person who had truly seen her. She had mistaken his restraint for coldness and his generosity for a trap. The spiritual alignment she felt in that moment was agonizing. She saw herself clearly for the first time. Not as the heroic defender of a dying estate, but as a woman who had used her fear as a shield and her judgment as a sword. She had struck the only man who had offered her safety without a price. As the wind rattled the glass panes of the conservatory, the house seemed to sigh around her, a long, weary exhalation that mirrored her own soul. The vulture Duke was gone, replaced by a man of such profound, quiet integrity that it terrified her. She understood now that her blow had not broken him. It had merely been another noise in a world that already screams too loudly, and the shame of it settled into her bones, cold and permanent, like the frost that waited just beyond the glass. The library of Thorne Manor was a room that had long since surrendered its dignity to the slow, creeping advance of the damp. It was a mausoleum of forgotten ambitions, where the scent of decaying leather bindings and the sharp, metallic tang of cold stone hung heavy in the air, creating a climate of quiet, scholarly despair. Elara Thorne paused at the threshold, her own breath held tight within her chest, as if she feared that even the smallest inhalation might disturb the precarious balance of the dust motes dancing in the moonlight. The house was holding its breath. a familiar sensation that usually signaled a brewing storm within her father's temper. But tonight, the tension was different. It was centered on the man seated in the high-backed wing chair, his silhouette carved out of the shadows like a statue of weathered granite. Julian Vane did not turn when she entered. He was seated in a pool of absolute stillness, his broad shoulders squared against the dark, yet there was a frantic quality to his rigidity that Elara had begun to recognize. Her gaze fell instinctively to the side of his face, searching for the mark of her own hands. The violet bruise had begun to transition into a dull yellowish ghost of its former self. Yet it remained a vivid map of her panicked rebellion. It was a physical manifestation of a truth she had only recently begun to digest, that her blow had landed upon the only man who had looked at the Thorne debts and seen something worth saving. The silence in the room was not empty. It was filled with the aggressive, rhythmic assault of the grandfather clock. The mahogany giant stood in the corner, its pendulum swinging with a weight that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. To Elara, it was merely the sound of time passing, a reminder of the interest accruing on her father's various follies. But as she watched Julian, she saw him flinch. It was a microscopic movement, a tightening of the jaw, a slight contraction of the muscles around his eyes. But to her, it was as loud as a scream. He was leaning away from the sound as if it were a physical blow, his fingers digging into the velvet of the armrests until the fabric groaned under the pressure. Without a word, Elara crossed the room. Her stout boots made no sound on the threadbare carpet, her movements governed by the same practical competence she applied to the meticulous care of her lunar orchids. She reached the clock and opened the glass cabinet, the hinges emitting a faint silver protest. She reached inside, her ink-stained fingers tracing the delicate curve of the heavy brass pendulum. She stilled the golden disc, feeling the vibration of the gears die beneath her touch, and then she carefully eased the weights into a position of rest. The silence that followed was sudden and absolute. It was a soft velvet thing that wrapped around the room, shielding them from the world outside the library walls. The menacing quiet, it seemed, had lost its bite. Elara did not move away immediately. She stood by the silent clock, her hand still resting on the cool glass, watching the man in the chair. Julian's entire body seemed to deflate. The iron tension in his spine dissolved, and he let out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like a confession. Julian finally turned his head, his grey eyes searching hers in the dim light. They were the colour of a winter sea, turbulent and deep, and at last they were stripped of the mask of his formal title. He looked at her not as a creditor looks at a debtor, nor as a suitor looks at a prize, but as a drowning man looks at the shore. He did not speak for a long time, and when he finally did, his voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to have been dragged from a great depth. He told her, in fragments that felt like broken glass, of the world he inhabited. He described a reality where every sound was a hammer, where the rustle of a silk gown was a rasping blade, and where the relentless chatter of the London season was a storm that threatened to tear his mind asunder. He had spent 10 years building a fortress of silence, a wall of cold, unapproachable dignity that the world had mistaken for arrogance. People were a weather he could not endure, and so he had become a stone, unmoving and unfeeling, until she had stepped into the dark of the conservatory and struck him. Julian reached up, his fingers hovering just an inch away from the fading mark on his jaw. He did not touch it, but the gesture was more intimate than any embrace. He spoke of how his family and the peers of the realm looked at him. To his mother, the dowager, he was a legacy to be managed. To the men in the clubs, he was a title to be feared. To the women at the balls, he was a fortune to be won. He had become a ghost in his own life, a walking shadow draped in fine tailoring, walking through rooms where people saw only the shadow of his rank and the vacuum of his presence. "In 7 years," he whispered, his voice catching on the jagged edges of his own history. She was the first person who had looked at him and not seen a grave. He explained that when she had struck him in the darkness, she had not been fighting a duke or a ghost. She had been fighting a man she believed was a threat to the thing she loved. She had seen him as a living, breathing obstacle, a person worthy of her fury and her protection. The slap had been a testament to his existence, a spark of genuine human contact that had pierced through the frozen layers of his grief. Elara felt the weight of his words settle in the marrow of her bones. She realized then that the pride she had taken in her rebellion was a hollow thing compared to the vulnerability he was offering her now. She had judged him by the arithmetic of his reputation, assuming that a man of such power must inherently be a creature of cruelty. She had looked at the ledgers and the rumors, but she had failed to look at the man. The library seemed to grow warmer, though no fire burned in the hearth. It was the warmth of two solitudes recognizing one another, of two architects of isolation deciding to build a bridge instead of a wall. Julian's hand finally dropped from his jaw, coming to rest on the arm of the chair, his palm open in a silent invitation. Elara did not take it yet. Propriety and the lingering echoes of her father's lies still held her in check, but she did not move away. She stood in the sanctuary they had created in the stillness, realizing that being seen by the right person was not the danger she had feared. It was the only safety worth the name. The hallway was a long, unlit artery of the house where the shadows pooled like ink against the warped oak of the wainscoting. Thorne Manor had always been a structure of secrets, a house that seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable collapse of the family that inhabited its brittle bones. Elara moved through the gloom with a silent grace, her boots making no sound on the threadbare carpet until the sharp, jagged edge of a laugh sliced through the stillness. It was a common sound, coarse and devoid of the careful modulations of the parlor, coming from the recess of the butler's pantry where the younger footman gathered to trade the currency of gossip. "He sits there like a statue of salt," a voice whispered. Miller, a lad whose ambition far outstripped his discretion. You could fire a pistol beside his ear and the High Lord would not so much as blink. He is a hollow man, I tell you, a vacancy in a fine coat. If that is what the high-born call dignity, I would rather be a common dog. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of Julian's perceived absence. Elara felt a spark of indignation ignite in the hollow of her chest, a heat that burned through the lingering exhaustion of her hours in the conservatory. She did not hesitate. She stepped into the doorway of the pantry, her spine as straight as a ledger line, her presence expanding to fill the cramped space. The boy Miller turned, the mockery dying on his lips as he met the cold, silver-grey iron of her gaze. "Your station, Miller, does not grant you the privilege of interpreting His Grace's silence," Elara said, her voice dropping into a register of ancient authority. The Thorne voice, inherited from ancestors who had commanded fleets and balanced empires. "What you mistake for vacancy is a composure you are constitutionally incapable of understanding. He possesses a stillness that is earned through trials you cannot fathom, and it is a stillness that commands this house far more effectively than your idle chatter ever shall." The footman faltered, his hands fumbling with a silver tray. He looked for a moment as if he might protest, but Elara took a single step forward, the light from the corridor catching the faint, ink-stained tips of her fingers. She was a woman who worked, who audited, who protected, and in that moment she was the Duke's self-appointed shield. "If I hear another word regarding the Duke's slowness or his vacancy, you will find yourself seeking employment in the soot-choked alleys of the glassworks by sunset," she continued, her tone clipped and final. "Am I understood?" The boy murmured a terrified affirmative and vanished into the shadows of the servants' stairs. Elara remained for a moment, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She turned and found Julian standing at the far end of the gallery, a shadow among shadows. He had heard everything. He did not speak, but the light caught the faint, lingering mark on his jaw, the violet bruise that she had given him in the dark. It was no longer a sign of her terror, but a secret bond between them. Julian did not offer thanks. He simply inclined his head, a movement so subtle it was almost a thought. In that gesture, Elara realized that being his sound was not a burden, but a sanctuary she was beginning to cherish. The victory over the insolent footman was short-lived, however, as the external world arrived at the gates of Thorne Manor with the thunderous finality of a creditor's knock. The sound of wheels on gravel reached Elara before the summons did, a heavy four-horse carriage that carried the unmistakable scent of sandalwood and old, unforgiving silk. Catherine Vane, the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne, had arrived, and the very air in the manor seemed to grow colder, as if the house itself were bracing for an audit. Elara was summoned to the drawing-room an hour later. She had tried to scrub the soil of the conservatory from her skin, but the lunar orchids were demanding mistresses, and a faint crescent of dark earth remained beneath her fingernails, a mark of her labor that she could not entirely erase. She found the dowager seated in the center of the room, a woman carved from granite and dressed in midnight taffeta. Catherine did not rise. She simply watched as Elara crossed the floor, her eyes as sharp and cold as a winter morning in the north. "So," Catherine began, her voice a dry rustle that seemed to sap the humidity from the room. "This is the young woman Julian has seen fit to sequester himself with. My son has always been a connoisseur of silence, Miss Thorne, but I find myself wondering if you are a companion to that silence, or merely a symptom of his decline." Elara felt the weight of the Thorne ledger, which she had left on the side table, acting as a silent witness to the family's ruin. She met the dowager's gaze without flinching. "I am a neighbor who understands the value of a quiet room, Your Grace. Silence is not always a decline. Sometimes it is the only place where a soul can truly breathe after the noise of the world becomes too loud to bear." Catherine's lip curled in a gesture that was not quite a sneer. She reached out a gloved hand and took Elara's wrist, pulling her closer with a strength that belied her age. She turned Elara's hand over, inspecting the palm and then the nails with the scrupulous intensity of a merchant examining a questionable pearl. "Ink on the knuckles, soil beneath the nails," Catherine remarked, her voice dropping into a tone of quiet, aristocratic disdain. "You have the hands of a common gardener or a clerk, Miss Thorne. Do you intend to enter the Ashbourne lineage with the dirt of the glassworks still clinging to your skin? Propriety is not a suggestion in our circles. It is the arithmetic of our survival." Elara did not pull her hand away. She stood her ground, her ink-stained fingers, which had spent the afternoon auditing the very figures Silas now sought to weaponize, were steady. "The soil is from the orchids that were dying before your son helped me save them, Your Grace. And the ink is from the ledgers that I have spent the last 3 nights auditing to ensure my father's debts are solvent. If propriety requires me to be idle and useless while my world burns, then I fear I am ill-suited for your circles. But Julian has looked at these hands and seen something other than a grave." The dowager froze. The mention of her son's name, and the implication of his intimacy with Elara's work, seemed to strike a chord of dissonance in her cold composure. She released Elara's wrist, her gaze shifting to the window where the grey sky promised more rain. For a moment, the silence between the two women had teeth, a jagged tension that threatened to tear the fragile peace of the morning apart. Catherine Vane looked at Elara not as a commoner, but as a threat, an intellectual equal who dared to see the man beneath the title. "You are a dangerous creature, Miss Thorne," Catherine whispered, the rustle of her taffeta sounding like a warning. "Julian thinks he has found a sanctuary. I think he has found a mirror, and mirrors have a way of breaking when the pressure becomes too great." The morning room was a sanctuary of shadows and soft amber, a place where the architecture of the house seemed to draw a deep, restorative breath. The dowager had retired early to her chambers, leaving Elara Thorne and Julian Vane to a dinner that felt less like a formal requirement of their arrangement and more like a quiet parley between two souls who had spent too long in the wind. The table was small, bringing them into a proximity that felt both dangerous and inevitable. The scent of bergamot and beeswax hung heavy in the air, a sensory anchor that grounded the flickering tension between them. Julian sat with a stillness that was almost sculptural, his posture as scrupulous as a mathematical equation. He was a stoic figure cloaked in tragedy, yet in the dim light, the jagged edges of his usual stoicism seemed to find a rare equilibrium. He did not engage in the empty chatter that usually characterized the Thorne dinner table. Instead, he watched Elara with a profound attention that made her feel as though she were being read like a complex ledger. His grey eyes, usually as cold as damp slate, seemed to catch the candlelight, softening into a hue that reminded her of the sky just before a summer storm breaks. "The silence here," Julian remarked, his voice a low vibration that cut through the stillness without shattering it. "It is different from the silence in London. There, the quiet is merely the absence of noise, a hollow thing. Here, it feels solvent." Elara looked up from her plate, her own ink-smudged hands resting against the white linen of the tablecloth. She felt the weight of his observation, the intellectual spark that always seemed to ignite when they were alone. Perhaps it is because this house has a memory, Your Grace. It does not merely stand. It remembers the people who have lived within its bones. The silence is not empty. It is full of the things we have chosen not to say. Julian leaned forward, the motion deliberate and slow. And what have you chosen not to say tonight, Elara? The use of her name without her title was a breach of propriety, yet it felt like the most honest word spoken in that room for a century. Elara felt a tremor of something that was not quite fear, a thawing hope that was far more terrifying than any debt. I was thinking of the orchids, she admitted, her voice steady despite the rapid beat of her heart. They are the only things I have ever found that require the same amount of care as a human soul. They need precisely the right environment, the right measure of light and shadow, or they simply withdraw. Julian's gaze remained fixed on her face. I have spent a decade navigating a world that is too bright and too loud. I have often felt that I was constitutionally ill-equipped for the clamor of my own life. Most people speak in colors that are a jagged assault on the senses, a chaotic red or a piercing, unforgiving yellow, but your voice, it is different. He paused, his gray eyes searching hers for a moment before he found the words he sought. Your voice is the color of silver-white orchids. It is the only sound I have heard in 7 years that does not feel like a wound. The poetic weight of the statement settled over Elara like a shroud of silk. She had spent her life being overlooked, the competent wallflower who managed the ledgers while the world looked past her for more glittering prizes. But in this room, under the gaze of a leader who had survived a war of sensory truth, she was being seen, not as a daughter or a payment, but as a sanctuary. Silver white, she repeated, the words a soft exhaled breath. I believe that is the only beautiful thing anyone has ever said to me. It is not a compliment, Julian replied, his voice dropping to a rasp. It is a fact. Numbers do not lie, and neither does the light. The intimacy of the moment was severed by a sound from the depths of the house, a sharp metallic groan, followed by a sudden jarring silence. Elara's head snapped toward the door. She knew every groan of the manor's joints, every sigh of its ancient lungs. That sound was the death rattle of the conservatory's heating system. The furnace, she whispered, her face draining of color. The pipes have failed. Without waiting for a response, she was on her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. Julian followed her, his silence replaced by a dynamic, focused energy. They moved through the cold hallways, the temperature dropping with every step they took toward the glass structure. The night outside was an unforgiving granite gray, and the frost was already beginning to lace the edges of the window panes like a shroud. When they burst into the conservatory, the air was already biting. The damp heat that usually sustained the lunar brood had vanished, replaced by a creeping crystalline cold. Elara rushed to the iron stove, her hands frantic as she checked the valves. The pressure has dropped. The water is freezing in the lines. If the roots catch the frost, they are lost. She was near tears, her usual competence failing her in the face of such absolute, natural destruction. These flowers were her legacy, her only beauty in a world of ink and arithmetic. She began to grab the heavy burlap sacks, trying to cover the most vulnerable plants, but the cold was moving faster than she could manage. It is no use, she sobbed, her breath blossoming in the air like a ghost. The glass is too thin. The house is holding its breath, Julian. It is letting them die. Julian did not offer words of comfort. Instead, he moved with the decisive grace of one who had survived a war within his own mind. He stripped off his heavy wool coat, the fine fabric hitting the damp stone with a dull thud, as he draped it over the central cluster of orchids. He moved to the next bench, shedding his waistcoat, then his cravat, using every piece of his attire to create a barrier against the encroaching ice. "Julian, stop!" Elara cried, reaching out to catch his arm. "You will catch your death in this air." "Your health." He turned to her, his shirt sleeves stark white against the deepening shadows of the conservatory. His jaw was tight, the violet bruise she had given him days ago still a faint, haunting mark on his skin. "I have worn my grief like weather for 7 years, Elara. I have lived in a winter of my own making, since the day I realized the world would never be quiet. This cold? It is nothing." He stepped closer, his presence a heavy, grounding weight that seemed to push back the freezing air. "These flowers are the only reason you have smiled since I arrived. I will not let the frost take the silver white from this house. Not tonight." He stood there in the freezing damp, his body a living shield between the orchids and the night. He was a man of immense power, a duke of the realm. Yet he was sacrificing his own warmth to save a handful of petals for a woman who had once struck him in the dark. Elara looked at him and saw not a grave, but a fortress of iron-hard integrity. The stillness, she realized, no longer felt threatening. It had become the only safety worth the name. She moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his in the dark. His palm was searingly hot, a frantic living warmth against the cold stone of the world. "We will wait with them," she said, her voice steadying. "We will be the heat they need." Together, they stood in the freezing conservatory, two guarded hearts beginning to thaw in the very place where the world was trying to turn to ice. The dawn arrived at Thorne Manor not as a herald of warmth, but as a scrupulous witness to the night's exhaustion. The light was the color of a fresh bruise, a pale, sickly violet that filtered through the frosted glass of the conservatory, illuminating the wreckage of the battle against the cold. Within that fragile cathedral of iron and glass, the air remained thick with the scent of damp earth and the sulphurous ghost of the failing charcoal braziers. Elara Thorne stood amidst the shadows, her breath blooming in small, rhythmic clouds as she leaned over the lunar orchids. The rare silver-white flowers were no longer the vibrant specters they had been. They were curled and delicate, but the life within them held firm. They had survived the frost. Though only by the narrowest of margins, their survival a testament to a night of frantic, back-breaking labor that had pushed the limits of human endurance. Beside her, the titled master sat upon a low wooden bench, his back pressed against the cold stone of a planter. Julian Vane had not moved for nearly an hour, his frame as still as the statues that lined the estate's neglected galleries. He had spent the long, dark hours moving between the vents and the heaters, his high-status garments now soot-stained and discarded in a pile near the door. He wore only his waistcoat and linen shirt, the fabric clinging to his shoulders with the dampness of the room. As the morning light grew stronger, Elara finally looked at him, not as the phantom she had struck in the dark, nor as the powerful aristocrat her father had chosen to settle a debt, but as a man who had bled his own heat into the very air to save the things she loved. Her gaze fell upon his hands, which rested heavily on his knees. They were large, structured hands, the fingers long and once meticulously groomed, but now they were a terrifying shade of marble white, tinged with a raw, angry red at the knuckles. They were trembling, a fine, persistent vibration that he seemed unable to master. In the silence of the conservatory, the sight of that uncontrollable shiver from a lord who prided himself on iron-hard restraint was more piercing than any cry of pain. Julian had worn his grief like weather for 7 years, and uniquely since he had entered the Thorne gates, the elements had finally breached his defenses. Elara realized with a jolt of recognition that he was freezing, his body spent and his constitutionally quiet nature pushed to the brink of collapse. Without a word, Elara moved toward him. She did not ask for permission, for in this damp green sanctuary, the propriety of the drawing room held no dominion. She knelt before him on the grit-covered floor, her ink-stained fingers finding the broad, calloused hands of the Duke. When her skin touched his, she nearly gasped. He was as cold as the granite of his own ancestral mausoleum. She pulled his hands into her own, bringing them close to her chest, and began to rub them with a frantic, rhythmic pressure. It was a reversal of the gesture she had performed for the orchids only hours before. A desperate attempt to force life back into extremities that had surrendered to the frost. Julian did not pull away. He did not even flinch. He watched her as if she were the first living thing he had seen in a decade. His breath hitched, a sharp, jagged inhalation that broke the heavy stillness of the room. For a long moment, the only sound was the scuff of her palms against his skin and the distant, lonely call of a winter bird in the thorn woods. She felt the heat of her own body beginning to transfer to him, the slow, thrumming arithmetic of biology working to undo the damage of the night. Her heart beat against his knuckles, a steady, insistent pulse that acted as a metronome for their shared survival. The silence between them changed then. It was no longer a void or a threat. It was a bridge. Julian's fingers began to curl, just slightly, against her palms, the blood returning in a painful, prickling rush that made his jaw tighten. He looked down at their joined hands, and at that instant, Elara saw a flicker of the man the stoic Duke could be. The lines of his face, usually so rigid and calculated, softened into something raw and profoundly observant. He looked at her as if she were the first living thing he had seen in a decade, his gaze moving from her soot-smudged forehead to the fierce, protective light in her eyes. "You should not be the one to tend me, Miss Thorne," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through his very chest. "I am the intruder here. I am the one who brought the winter into your house." It was the first time he had spoken of the night they met with such directness, and the subtext of his words carried the weight of a confession. He was not just speaking of the frost or the failed heating system. He was speaking of the shadow he cast, the reputation of the vulture duke that had preceded him like a storm. He had lived so long in the isolation of his own mourning that he had forgotten the sensation of a human touch that was not a demand or a social performance. Elara did not stop her movements. She gripped his hands tighter, her thumbs tracing the ridges of his knuckles. "You are the man who saved these flowers," she countered, her voice steady and lacking the frantic edge of her earlier panic. "And you are the man who stood still in the dark while I struck you. Do not speak to me of propriety now, Your Grace. Numbers do not lie, and the arithmetic of this night shows me a man who would rather freeze than see a life, even a floral one, extinguished under his watch. She looked up at him, her spine as straight as the iron pillars of the roof. "I told you I would never marry you. I told a stranger I hated him. I spoke to a ghost because I did not know how to look at the man." Julian's gaze intensified, the coolness in his eyes thawing into a haunted curiosity. He leaned forward, just a fraction, his presence becoming a heavy, grounding weight that anchored her to the spot. "The slap," he murmured, the words barely more than a breath. "It was the first honest thing that has happened to me in 7 years. In London they bow. They whisper. They treat me like a grave that has been decorated with a title. They look at me and see only the dead air of Ashbourne." He paused, his gaze dropping to the faint, faded mark on his jaw that was now nearly invisible. "But you, Elara, you hit me. You looked at the shadow and you fought it. It has been a very long time since I felt anything at all. But in that moment, in the dark of this room, I felt real. The admission was a gift, a vulnerability so profound that it made the grand manor house feel small around them." Julian was admitting that her act of rebellion, her primal terror and accidental violence, had been the catalyst that broke his stasis. He was a man who had worn his grief like a suit of armor, and she had found the one crack in the plate. The violet bruise had not been an injury to his pride, it had been an awakening to his soul. As her warmth finally seeped into his bones, Elara realized that being seen by the right person was not the danger she had feared. It was the only safety worth the name in a world of cold, calculating ledgers. She did not let go of his hands, and finally in many years he did not see a pawn. The drawing room of Thorne Manor had always been a vessel for ghosts, but as the evening shadows stretched across the frayed Persian rugs, it became a theatre for a far more predatory haunting. Silas Blackwood did not merely enter a room. He occupied it with a calculated, abrasive dissonance that seemed designed to bruise the very air. He arrived without the courtesy of a preceding card, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic, accompanied by a retinue of legal clerks whose presence felt like a deliberate stain upon the house's fading dignity. In his hand, Silas carried a heavy silver-topped cane, and his eyes, sharp and devoid of the scrupulous grace common to men of Julian's station, immediately sought out the Duke. Silas knew. He had observed Julian Vane during the preceding weeks. The way the man flinched at the sharp strike of a grandfather clock, the way his breath hitched when a door was closed with too much vigor. To Silas, this sensitivity was not a mark of a refined soul, but a profound constitutional weakness to be exploited for profit. He moved toward the mahogany table, where the Thorne ledger lay open, its ink-stained pages representing the only honest arithmetic left to the family. With a smirk that did not reach his cold eyes, Silas began his assault. He did not use a blade, he used sound. He spoke in a booming, unnecessary register, his voice echoing off the high ceilings like a drum. Every word regarding the liquidation of the glassworks was delivered with a jarring force, and between sentences, he began to tap his cane against the floorboards, a sharp, metallic crack that vibrated through the floor and into the bones of the house itself. It was a sonic orchestration of malice, a deliberate attempt to overwhelm Julian's fragile equilibrium and prove to any witness that Julian was a man of broken glass, a hollowed-out aristocrat unfit to govern his own senses, let alone a sprawling industrial estate. Julian remained seated, his posture a study in agonizing restraint. The violet bruise on his jaw had long since faded to a ghost of a memory, but the internal pressure he faced now was far more visceral. Elara Thorne, standing by the heavy velvet curtains, felt the atmospheric shift as clearly as a change in weather. She watched the color drain from Julian's face until he was the shade of weathered marble, his grey eyes fixed on a single point on the ledger to avoid the chaos Silas was weaving around him. The Duke's fingers, long and elegant, gripped the edge of the table until the knuckles were white, a silent testament to the storm raging within his sensory world. Silas increased the tempo of his cane, the clatter of the clerk's pens and the rustle of papers adding layers to the cacophony. The room, which had briefly become a sanctuary of shared silences and low-voiced confessions, was being transformed back into a mausoleum. Silas leaned in, his face mere inches from Julian's, and shouted a question regarding the interest rates of the Thorne debts, his breath hot and his tone a jagged edge. Julian did not blink, but a single rhythmic tremor began in his right hand, a signal of the impending collapse. The oppressive silence felt like a trap, and Silas was using the noise to tear the Duke's dignity to ribbons. It was a calculated cruelty, a realization that Julian's greatest strength, his profound, quiet observation, was also his most vulnerable point of entry for a bully who understood only the language of volume and force. Elara moved before she had consciously decided to act. She did not scream, nor did she meet Silas's aggression with her own, for she had learned through weeks of quiet labor that Julian's world was mended by the absence of friction, not the addition of it. She stepped into the center of the room with a terrifying, absolute stillness that seemed to draw the light toward her plain, dark dress. Her ink-stained fingers, which had spent the afternoon auditing the very figures Silas now sought to weaponize, were steady. She walked directly to the mahogany table and placed her hand firmly over the head of Silas's cane, arresting its rhythmic torture mid-strike. The sudden cessation of the sound was more jarring than the noise itself. Silas froze, his mouth half open to deliver another booming decree, his eyes darting to the woman who dared to interrupt his performance. Elara did not look at Julian. She knew that to look at him now would be to acknowledge his vulnerability before his enemy. Instead, she fixed Silas with a gaze of such cold, unblinking clarity that the man visibly recoiled. When she spoke, her voice was a whisper, a low, controlled vibration that existed at a frequency so quiet it forced everyone in the room to stop breathing just to catch her words. She told him that his presence was no longer required, and that the propriety of the house would not be compromised by the theatrics of a man who mistook volume for authority. She used the silence between her words as a weapon, mimicking the heavy, grounding weight of Julian's own presence to create a barrier that Silas could not pierce. The effect was instantaneous. Without the feedback of an equal and opposite noise, Silas Blackwood's bravado began to feel like a grotesque and hollow display. He looked around the room, finding only the silent, judgmental shadows of the Thorne ancestors and the unwavering iron of Elara's stare. Julian, feeling the sudden anchor of her proximity, let out a long, shuddering breath, his hands finally relaxing their grip on the table. The frantic, jagged rhythm of his heart began to settle into the steady pace Elara provided. She stood there, a small but immovable force, proving that she had not only understood the Duke's silence, but had mastered it. She addressed the clerks with a scrupulous lack of emotion, ordering them to gather their papers and depart, her tone suggesting that any further sound would be met with a social consequence far more devastating than a legal one. Silas attempted one final, sputtering protest, but the words died in the heavy, airless quiet Elara had constructed. He realized, with a flicker of genuine fear, that he was no longer fighting a wounded man. He was fighting a woman who had adopted the Duke's stillness and forged it into a blade. As the retinue retreated, the house seemed to exhale, the bones of the manor settling back into their familiar somber peace. Elara remained where she was until the last echo of the carriage wheels had vanished down the gravel drive. Only then did she turn to Julian, her hand still resting near his on the ledger, acknowledging that their union was no longer a matter of debt or duty, but a shared survival in a world that was simply too loud for the honest architecture of their souls. He looked at her, and in the deepening twilight, he saw not a savior, but an equal, the only person who had ever understood that his silence was not a void, but a sanctuary worth defending. The glass of the conservatory hummed with the receding vibration of the storm. A fragile skin stretched over the pulse of the Thorne estate. Elara Thorne stood amidst the lunar orchids, her fingers still darker than the twilight, with the soot of the boilers and the black loam of the pots. She was a woman of ledgers and labor, a wallflower who had found her thorns. Yet as she looked at the man before her, the arithmetic of her heart refused to balance. Julian Vane did not move with the flamboyant grace of the London peacocks. He stood with a stillness that suggested the very architecture of the house had found a human form to inhabit. The air between them tasted of ozone, and the heavy, intoxicating perfume of the silver-white blooms that had, through their shared labor, survived the frost. In the pale lunar light reflecting off the glass panes, the violet bruise on Julian's jaw had faded to a ghost of a memory, yet it remained the most honest thing between them. It was the mark of her rebellion, the physical manifestation of the night she had struck a shadow and declared her hatred for a man she did not yet know. Now that same hand trembled as it hovered near her side. Julian stepped forward, his movements deliberate and slow, as if he were navigating a room filled with invisible glass. He did not offer a ring of diamonds or a contract of entailment. Instead, he reached out and waited, a silent invitation for her to bridge the final narrow gap between their worlds. "I told a stranger in the dark that I would never marry the Duke of Ashbourne," Elara whispered, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart against her ribs. "I told him that he was a heartless collector of ruins, a man who saw only the value of the stone and never the soul of the house. I was wrong, Julian. I was looking at the facade and ignoring the bones." She reached out, her ink-stained fingers finding the broad, calloused palm of the gentleman who had worn his grief like weather for 7 years. When their hands met, there was no lightning, only a profound, grounding heat, a sense of 2 jagged pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into a seamless whole. Julian did not speak immediately. He had always been a man who weighed his words with scrupulous care, as if each syllable carried a cost he was hesitant to pay. He turned his hand, interlacing his fingers with hers, and pressed their palms together. It was a gesture of absolute transparency, the glass vow. In this sanctuary of green and light, they were not a duke and a desperate daughter, but 2 architects of a new reality. "You did not strike a duke that night, Elara," he finally said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the very marrow of her bones. "You struck a man who had forgotten he was alive. You did not break my silence. You taught me that silence could be a sanctuary rather than a prison. I do not ask for your hand to settle a debt. I ask for it because without your voice the world is merely noise." The quiet between them no longer carried a bite. It was a soft, enveloping velvet that protected them from the expectations of the ton and the cruelty of men like Silas Blackwood. Elara leaned her forehead against Julian's shoulder, feeling the steady, rhythmic thrum of his heart. It was a redemptive moment, a settling of the accounts that had been unbalanced for a generation. She was not the payment for her father's failures. She was the partner in a new prosperity. They stood there for a long time, 2 silhouettes against the shimmering backdrop of the lunar orchids, acknowledging the hand that had once struck in fear and now held on in deep, unshakable devotion. Julian reached into the deep pocket of his greatcoat and produced a heavy, leather-bound volume that Elara recognized instantly. The Thorne Ledger. It was a room made of paper and ink, a place where her father had spent decades locked away, counting the coins he did not possess and the dignity he was slowly losing. Julian held it with a strange sort of reverence, his grey eyes fixed on the spine as if he could see the decades of suppressed grief etched into the leather. "They call me the vulture, Elara," he said, his tone devoid of bitterness, sounding instead like a man reciting a dry piece of arithmetic. "The world believes I circle the dying estates of England so that I might feast upon the remains of their pride. They see the acquisitions, but they never see the reason for the hunt." He opened the book to the final page, where the tally of the Thorne family's debts was written in her father's frantic, spindly hand. The numbers were brutal, an honest, unforgiving map of a family's descent into ruin. I gathered these ruins not to own them, but to keep the noise away. Julian confessed, his gaze turning to the dark garden beyond the glass. The world is too loud, Elara. The voices, the light, the constant clatter of ambition. It was a storm I could not weather. I bought silence. I bought distance. I became the vulture because a scavenger is left alone to his work. I allowed them to believe. I was heartless because it meant they would not attempt to touch a heart that was already shattered. Elara watched him, her understanding of the man deepening with every halting sentence. His stoicism was not a choice of arrogance, but a necessity of survival, a sensory shield against a world that processed reality at a frequency he could not endure. She realized then that his silence was his most precious possession, and he was offering to share it with her. Julian walked to the small iron stove used to keep the conservatory at the scrupulous temperature required by the orchids. With a flick of his wrist, he tore the final page from the ledger, the page that held the Thorne family in a stranglehold of interest and arrears. The paper caught the flame and curled, the ink of her father's failures turning to grey ash in the heat. Julian did not look away as the fire consumed the debt. "The arithmetic of our lives is no longer dictated by this book," he murmured, the light of the flames dancing in his cool grey eyes. "The debt is not paid. It is evaporated. It was a ghost that haunted these halls, and I will not have a ghost living in the house where you breathe." He closed the ledger and set it aside, the action final and rhythmic, like the closing of a grave that had stayed open far too long. He turned back to her, and astonishingly, Elara saw a flicker of something that resembled a smile, a subtle, intellectual spark that transformed his face from a marble statue into a living man. "In 7 years, you are the first person who has looked at me and not seen a grave, Elara. You saw a man who could be challenged. You saw a man who could be hit." He touched the spot on his jaw, where her palm had landed all those nights ago. "I am not a vulture, and you are not a victim. We are simply two people who have decided that the truth is a better architect than tradition." The smell of beeswax and singed paper lingered in the air, a sensory bridge between the cold, static past and the warm, dynamic future they were building, one quiet word at a time. The wedding was not a spectacle of silk and shouting, but a liturgy of light and shadow held within the glass ribcage of the Thorne conservatory. It was a space where the air remained perpetually calibrated to the exact, scrupulous requirement of the silver-white lunar orchids, a stillness so profound that one could hear the condensation sliding down the panes like a shared secret between the house and the heavens. The manor, once a mausoleum of neglected debts and frozen grief, seemed to be breathing in a new rhythm, its mahogany bones settling into a peace it had not known for a generation. Arthur Thorne stood with a straight, if somewhat brittle, spine, his pride no longer a shield of intricate lies, but a quiet acceptance of the honest arithmetic that had brought them to this threshold. He watched his daughter, and finally, in many years, he did not see a pawn or a debt to be paid. He saw the mistress of an architecture he had nearly destroyed, restored by the very hands he had once sought to sell. There were no hundreds of guests to drain the silence of its meaning, or to calculate the cost of the lace against the value of the dowry. Only those who had learned the intricate language of petals and the specific weight of a promise made in the dark were permitted to witness the union. Julian Vane stood at the center of the green cathedral, his grey eyes no longer the color of an impending winter storm, but reflecting the soft, pearlescent glow of the blossoms he had helped to save. He wore his title not as a weapon of social distance, but as a garment that finally fit the contours of his weary shoulders. Beside him, Elara approached with a step that was both certain and light, her fingers no longer stained with the black ink of desperate accounting, yet still bearing the invisible, honorable callouses of her labor. She carried no bouquet of cut roses that would wither by morning. Instead, she walked among the living orchids, her presence a natural extension of the garden she had protected with her life. The ceremony was conducted in a register barely above a whisper, a concession to the Duke's delicate sensory constitution, and a testament to the sacred fragility of the moment. The clergyman spoke the ancient words as if he were reading from a long-lost ledger of the soul, and when Julian spoke his vows, the sound was a low rumble that seemed to anchor the very air. In 7 years, he had been one who wore his grief like weather, but as he looked at Elara, the frost finally receded from his gaze. It was a union of intellectual equals, a marriage of convenience that had transformed into a partnership of profound recognition. They did not promise to love in the hollow, flowery language of the season. They promised to see one another, to protect the silence, and to ensure that the house never had to hold its breath in fear again. As the few witnesses retreated toward the parlor, leaving the glass house to the rising moon, Julian turned to his wife. The silver light caught the sharp angle of his jaw, the place where, in the pitch-black terror of a summer storm, a violent collision had sparked the end of his isolation. He reached out and took Elara's right hand, the one that had delivered the blow that broke a decade of cold stillness. He traced the lines of her palm with a slow, deliberate reverence, his touch a language of its own that required no translation. The violet bruise had long since faded from his skin, leaving no trace for the world to see, but they both carried the memory of its sting as the foundation of their truth. The Duke looked down at the hand that had once struck him in a fit of panicked defiance. The irony was not lost on him, that the most honest contact he had felt in years had been an act of rebellion against the very man he was supposed to be. He brought her palm to his lips, pressing a kiss into the center of it with a gravity that made the surrounding orchids seem to lean closer in the stillness. It was the completion of a redemptive cycle, a physical acknowledgement that her blow had not been an injury, but a mercy. It had been the sound of a struck bell, shattering the glass walls he had built around his own heart. "You did not break me, Elara," he murmured, his voice ghosting against her skin in the quiet of their sanctuary. "You woke me. In the dark of that first night, you told a stranger that you would never marry the heartless man my father had chosen for you. And you were right. I could never have been that man. But in the light of this morning, I realized that the woman who struck me was the only person who ever looked at me and did not see a grave. You saw a man worth fighting, and in doing so, you made me a man worth loving." Elara leaned her forehead against his shoulder, feeling the steady, living warmth of him beneath the fine wool of his coat. The quiet between them no longer carried a bite. It was a soft, encompassing velvet that promised a future of shared work and intellectual parity. The lunar orchids continued their slow silver blooming, indifferent to the titles and the scandals of the world outside the glass, existing only in the precise temperature of the love that had saved them. The ledger of their lives was no longer a record of debts and shadows, but a clean page, white and expectant as the midnight petals, waiting for the first honest word to be written. Being seen by the right person was not the danger she had once feared. It was the only safety worth the name. As they stood together in the heart of the conservatory, the Duke and his Duchess were no longer strangers caught in a tangle of family duty and financial ruin. They were the architects of a new house, one built on the site of the old ruins, where the windows were always clean and the doors were never locked against the truth. The long night of their isolation had ended, and the dawn, when it finally arrived, would be the color of the flowers they had tended in the dark. Have you ever felt that the world only saw the surface of your life, missing the quiet competence and the strength you carry in secret? Sometimes the person who truly sees us is the one we least expect to meet in the shadows. We would love to hear where you are listening from tonight, and if there is a sanctuary in your own life where you finally feel understood. May your own house breathe with peace tonight. Good night from the fireside.